This is a Book Potato interview. Today I am speaking with Helen Llyod. Helen is an audio book performer and actor. Helen, hello.
Hello, Tom. Nice to meet you.
Yes, likewise. We spoke a few weeks ago before this, and we've just been speaking now. Um, and again, what I think maybe a lot of people might be wondering is exactly what an audiobook performer is. Obviously, I'm sure they could sort of make a fairly educated guess, but what is an audiobook performer, and how did you become one?
I think probably the best description of an audiobook performer is a storyteller.
Sure.
Because at the end of the day, that's what you're doing when you narrate an audiobook, is telling the story. It's slightly more complicated than just being a reader or just reading aloud,
Mm,
because you have to, not only do you have to stay true to the author's intentions and tell the story as the author intended it to be told, but you also have to create individual voices along with all the emotional
yeah,
content for every one of the characters. And each of those characters has to be individually identifiable and separate from the narrative voice, the voice of the author, if you like.
sure, sure.
So there's a lot to it. I mean, my background is I was an actor for many years. Um, I then moved into. I mean, I trained as an actor. I then worked as an actor. I then moved into television as a presenter. I then moved sideways into television production. I then took redundancy and moved back into the theatre again, and started doing video production and also tutoring, teaching for theatre students. And then I thought I'd done voiceovers all the way along the line from about 1980. I recorded my first audiobook in 1982, I think.
Oh,
Thankfully now long gone, no longer in existence, because I'm sure it was dreadful. And so I set up a studio at home, um, and I started doing audiobooks again in about 2013.
sure. So that's quite a list of things and lots of experience you can obviously
I
draw.
reinvent myself. It's reinventions.
Sure. Well, again, I think that's a brilliant thing, and many people need to. You need
Yes,
to
absolutely.
be
Well,
fluent.
it's essentially all of the things that I've ever done have been to do with words and language and interpretation and, to a degree, performance. Because even, excuse me, even as a television producer, you're directing other people to give the performance. Although I was making documentaries, you're directing presenters and people that are being interviewed to a degree to give the performance that you want them to give. So it's all been to do with interpretation of language and the use of words and conveying emotion and feelings and excitement and information to other people. So in a sense, doing audiobooks has just tied all of those little strands together
Sure.
into one thing that I can do. I've got a good face for radio now I'm older, so it works very well.
um, would you like to mention some of the audiobooks you've worked on and even the documentaries you made? Plus, maybe your favorite ones or ones you think that are
Well,
good examples.
the documentaries, it won't mean a lot to anybody who doesn't live in the Midlands, apart from a few
Right.
of them, because I was working for ITV Regional, based in Birmingham and Nottingham, for
Okay.
what was ITV Central and which became ITV Carlton. But I did 5 series of Waterworld, I think it was 5 series with Timothy West, which was all about canal boats, which was great fun. Spending summers running up and down canal towpaths with a camera strung or a set of tripods slung over my shoulder.
Sure.
That was fun. And I worked on the first series of Countrywise with Paul Heine, the network series. Um, and I did lots of stuff, all kinds of documentaries about everything from health and beauty to narrowboats. You can't get much broader than that. But I also, at the same time, was doing lots and lots of narration work for television documentaries. I was obviously very lucky. I was in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
So I did it. I did think I narrated about 50 documentaries for ITV at that time. So that was really, really great. As far as audiobooks are concerned, I've done I generally do about one a month.
Sure.
Which isn't a lot in the great scheme of things if you're working in a mainstream studio, because obviously if you're in a mainstream recording studio, you've got an engineer on the other side of the glass,
Yeah.
and it takes you know, the whole process is condensed. You'll do a 13-hour book in 3.5 days. But an awful lot of the work that I do, I record remotely from my own space
Yeah.
in Derbyshire, and I'm working a lot of the time. I'm working for American publishers and producers, so I'm working. I'm uh, I'm not producing it, they're producing it, but I'm recording and doing all of that independently, so I can spread the load. I don't have to
Yeah.
shove the whole thing into 3.5 days. I can spread over 2 weeks, providing the deadlines allow.
Yeah.
And it gives a wonderful flexibility, because it means that if I want to start really early in the morning, although I rarely do, I generally tend to work very late at night, partly because it's quieter, and I think also because of my theatre background, my voice sort of comes alive in the evening.
That's
Um,
interesting.
it sort of works better at night than it does in the morning.
Yeah. Of course. I wouldn't have even sort of realized that. But yes, I'm sure you. That's absolutely correct.
Yeah, it's. I think also. I mean, I certainly concentrate better in the evening. I don't know whether I have. They used to call it night starvation, didn't they? When we woke up in the morning and your whole body was sort of just not functioning quite. I'm not saying I don't function in the mornings, of course I do, but I tend to get quite. I just don't concentrate as well. It's just I'm not used to working early in the morning, so I
That's
do an awful lot of stuff late
yeah.
at night. Quite often, I'm still recording at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning.
Wow. That's interesting actually, because I would say I'm similar way actually. I get a lot more ideas at night.
Yeah,
Um, and I've never really been a morning person, although recent scenarios has sort of forced me to have to get up earlier and get things done. But yeah, I would prefer to wake up slightly later and
yeah.
work later myself. So yeah,
Yes.
um,
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I was never an early riser at all until I had kids. And then having a baby makes you get up early. And now I suppose I burn the candle at both ends. I very rarely sleep past 9 o'clock. And I know that sounds late to a lot of people who do, in
commute.
inverted commas, a proper job.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but for me, that's actually quite. I mean, normally I'm up at about 7:30, 8 o'clock.
yeah.
Um, but
That's
then
good.
I do keep going until 1 o'clock in the morning very regularly.
Oh, wow.
Quite often have a Z in the afternoon though.
Yeah, yeah. You gotta recharge
Yeah,
some.
yeah, absolutely.
No, but again, I think basically it's whatever works for you, isn't it? And that's
Yes, it is.
the
It is. It
flexibility
is.
of doing what
It
you do,
is.
which is
But
great.
but working remotely, being able to work in my own studio, although there's a lot more involved because obviously I've had to learn all the technical stuff as well. Although the television stuff that I was doing was, I mean, I was editing and researching and all of that, so that helps. It gives me that flexibility, and I don't have to talk to myself for 8 hours a day, which is, it's tough on the voice, it's tough on the concentration.
Yeah,
So although I love being in a studio because you've then got some contact with the outside world, and sometimes it is a little bit like talking to yourself in a padded cell, um, it does give me a huge amount of flexibility, which I like. I do enjoy working that way.
sure, sure. Do you have any exciting plans for future books coming up? Something you're looking forward to?
I have, but I can't say anything about them because I don't like to jinx them,
Sure.
and B, there is almost always, with any of the major publishers, a non-disclosure order.
Of course.
So I can't actually talk about them. I can talk about when I finished last week. I
Sure.
finished a book last week for Harper called Hello, My Name is May. And I know I can talk about it because it's already up listed on Audible as coming soon.
Okay.
Um, and it's a fantastic book. It's really interesting. It's a lady who, in her late 70s, I suppose, who has had a stroke, who has lost her power of speech. So 50% of the book is an internal monologue with her and her frustration at not being able to communicate. And the other half of the book is a flashback to her as a young woman, and her marriage, a fairly disastrous marriage, in fact, completely disastrous marriage, and how those two stories get pulled together with the residents of a nursing home that she's in. I'm not going to give the game away or say any more, but it's kind of, I suppose you'd term it a thriller, although it isn't written as a thriller
Yeah.
because so much of it is the internal monologue. But it's a really interesting book. It's great. It's a smashing read. I thoroughly enjoyed doing it, and I really miss it now it's gone. It's
Sure. Sure.
that's the horrible. That's the one thing. The downside is that you get so involved in these books, and you learn to you are the person, you become
Yes.
the major character, and particularly when it's a first person narrative, which half of this was. So I was speaking as May. I was May. When they go, when you finish them, I really miss them. I really do. And quite often I then go back several months later and read the book again for pleasure.
Yes. No, I can see why, because you've immersed yourself into the characters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think maybe more authors, particularly perhaps on the smaller spectrum, if there is a spectrum, I guess there is a spectrum of authors, perhaps people that have only just published one book, or starting out, or even if they're attached to large publishers, but they haven't had a runaway success, or that sort of thing. Do you think, certainly in the UK, they overlook the concept of having an audio version of their book?
Absolutely. I think there are two things that are working against them. One, I mean, it doesn't happen in the US because virtually, I mean, the figures last year in the US, there were 86,000 audiobooks produced.
Sure.
Last year in the UK, there were 3,700 audiobooks produced. So it's a huge disconnect there. But a lot of the time, what happens when an author, I'm not talking necessarily about independent authors here, when an author is signed up with a publisher, very often the publisher will buy the audio rights, so without the author even having realized. So the author is essentially giving away the rights to the audiobook. And then if the book isn't perhaps successful, or if it isn't hugely successful, the audiobook never ever gets made. But it can't be made because the publisher holds the rights.
Yeah, of course. So
And if they make the decision not to do it for whatever reason, then it never happens. Whereas what happens increasingly in the States is that if the publisher isn't making the audiobook, or if the book is an independent production, and so many of them are these days, the author will get, there are ways and means that the author can have the audiobook made as long as they hang on to the rights. Quite often I get emails. I'll contact an author and say, I really loved reading or narrating the book for audio. And they'll come back and say, oh, I didn't even know there was an audiobook. So they're completely left out of the loop. They have no say in who reads it. They have no involvement in the casting. But they could, if they hung on to the audio rights themselves, or inquired about keeping the audio rights, or didn't just sign them over to the publisher, they could be producing and publishing their own audiobooks. There are so many ways of doing it now, and hiring the narrator that they want to read it, assuming that narrator is available.